Tonight, I want you to imagine something that may sound impossible at first. What if your country had to send half of its savings to another nation before it could build a single hospital, a single road, or even support its own farmers? Not for 1 year, not for 1 decade, but for more than 70 years. Now imagine, one day, someone finally says, "No more. Welcome back, my brothers and sisters across Africa, and to all of you watching from around the world, especially those who have seen history repeat itself more times than you can count. I wish you strength, peace, and clarity today. Because what we are about to uncover is not just another headline. It is something deeper, something that speaks to dignity, to control, to the quiet fight for sovereignty. In the heart of the Sahel, in a land many only hear about when there is conflict, something unusual happened. No explosions, no breaking news alerts, just a signature. A decision made behind closed doors that may one day be remembered as the moment everything began to change. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, a young captain carrying the weight of a generation that refuses to inherit silence. A historic shift has begun. A shift not driven by speeches, but by action. A shift that challenges a system that shaped the economic destiny of entire nations for decades. But this story is not just about leaders. It is about people like Issa, a farmer outside Ouagadougou, who has spent years watching his crops struggle to reach markets because roads were never built. Not because his land failed him, but because investment never reached him. So tonight, we ask a question that is as simple as it is dangerous. What really kept nations rich in resources, but poor in opportunity? And more importantly, is this the moment Africa finally takes back control? Or the beginning of a new kind of struggle the world is not ready for? Stay with me, because what comes next may challenge everything you thought you understood about power, money, and who truly decides the future of a nation. Now let's slow this down and really understand what just happened, because on the surface, it looks like a simple administrative decision, a decree, a policy shift, something you might scroll past in a headline. But underneath, it is something much bigger. For decades, across Burkina Faso and much of the Sahel, there existed a financial system that shaped everything, from how money moved to what could be built and what never could. It was called stability. But for many on the ground, it felt like limitation. You see, under this system, countries were required to deposit up to 50% of their foreign reserves in an external treasury. Now, I want you to pause right here and really think about that. Imagine working your entire life, saving money, building something for your family, and then being told that half of it must be kept somewhere else, somewhere you don't fully control. That is not just economics. That is power. And for years, this reality shaped decisions that most people never saw. Why certain roads were never completed. Why hospitals ran short on supplies. Why young entrepreneurs struggled to access funding. It wasn't always about lack of effort. Sometimes it was about lack of control. Let me take you back to Issa. Issa wakes up before sunrise. Every day, he walks his land, checks his crops, and prepares for a market that is miles away. But getting there is not simple. The road is rough. During the rainy season, it becomes nearly impossible. His harvest is good. His work is honest. But the system around him, it never quite worked in his favor. Because while Issa was doing everything right, the resources needed to support him were often tied up elsewhere, locked behind decisions made far beyond his reach. And that is where this moment begins to matter. Because under Ibrahim Traoré, something changed. A decree was signed, one that aims to redefine how financial resources are controlled, how they are used, and most importantly, who decides. For the first time in generations, There is a serious push to ensure that national wealth stays closer to home, that decisions about money reflect the needs of the people, not the expectations of distant institutions. Now, this is not a small adjustment. This is not a minor reform. This is a structural shift. Because when a nation gains more control over its reserves, it gains something even more important: flexibility. The ability to invest directly into infrastructure, agriculture, healthcare, local businesses, things that don't just grow an economy, but stabilize a society. And early signs, at least on the ground, suggest something is already changing. Communities are beginning to talk, not in loud political debates, but in quiet conversations. Maybe this time it will be different. Maybe this time the money stays. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. Because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They are connected to global finance, to international relationships, to decades of agreements and expectations. And when one piece moves, everything else feels it. Banks must adjust. Institutions must respond. Partners must reconsider. And that creates tension. Not always visible, not always immediate, but real. Because when control begins to shift, those who benefited from the old system don't always disappear quietly. So while this moment may feel like a breakthrough, it also carries uncertainty. Because the question is no longer just about what Burkina Faso wants to do. The real question is, what happens when a country decides to rewrite rules that others have relied on for decades? And even more importantly, is this the beginning of true economic freedom? Or the start of a new kind of pressure that has yet to reveal itself? Stay with me, because what happens next will show us not just how strong this decision is, but how the world reacts when Africa begins to take back control. And then, something shifted, not loudly. Not with celebration in the streets at first, but quietly, like a pressure that had been building for decades, finally finding a way out. The moment that decree was signed, it didn't just change policy, it changed perception. Across Burkina Faso, across the Sahel, people began to feel it.
In the markets of Ouagadougou,
Conversations started in low voices, traders leaning closer to each other, asking questions they had never dared to ask before. Is it really happening? Are we finally in control of our own money? For many older men, those who had lived through years of promises that never came, this moment felt different. Not because of what was said, but because of what was done. No speeches filled with empty words, just action. And that carries weight. In Bobo Dioulasso, a shop owner stood behind his counter, watching customers come and go. He had seen policies come and go too. But this time, he said something simple. For the first time, I feel like what we build might stay here. That sentence may not make headlines, but it tells you everything about what people have been missing. Not resources, not effort, but trust. Trust that what they create will benefit their own communities. And yet, while hope was rising in the streets, something else was happening, far beyond them. Because when a system that has lasted over 70 years begins to shift, it doesn't go unnoticed. Across financial circles, analysts began to pay attention. Not publicly at first, but quietly, carefully. Because the CFA system wasn't just a regional arrangement. It was part of a much larger structure, one tied to international finance, long-standing agreements, and global influence. And when Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, begins to challenge that structure, it sends a signal that others might follow. Now pause and think about that. If one country reclaims control, what stops another from doing the same? And another, and another. This is where the tension begins. Because what looks like independence to one side can look like instability to another. Some observers began to raise concerns, not always directly, but through language. You may recognize risk, uncertainty, economic instability, words that sound technical, but carry political weight. Because behind those words is a deeper question. Who controls the system? And what happens when that control is challenged? Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was emotional. Outside, it was strategic. Governments watched. Financial institutions evaluated. Partnerships were quietly reconsidered. Because when money moves differently, power moves differently. And history has shown us something important. Major shifts in economic control rarely happen without resistance. Not always visible, not always immediate, but always present. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because while people like Issa begin to hope for better roads, better access, better opportunity, there are forces, far more powerful than any single farmer, that are now paying very close attention. And they are asking their own questions. Can this model succeed? Will it spread? Should it be contained? You won't hear those questions on the evening news, but they exist, and they matter. Because the future of this decision will not be determined only by what happens inside Burkina Faso, but also by how the world chooses to respond. So now we arrive at a turning point. Hope on one side, pressure on the other. And a leader, young, determined, and untested on this scale, standing right in the middle of it. Which brings us to the question that could define everything that comes next. If the world decides this shift goes too far, will it allow it to succeed? Or will it try to slow it down before others follow? Stay with me. Because what happens next is not just about economics anymore. It's about power. And whether that power is truly changing hands, or simply being challenged for the first time in generations. Now, let's step away from the headlines and look at what this really means on the ground. Because every major decision, no matter how strategic, eventually reaches ordinary people. And when it does, that's when the true impact begins. If this shift succeeds, if Burkina Faso truly gains greater control over its financial resources, then what we are looking at is not just policy change. It is a transformation of daily life. Imagine this: a clinic in a rural village that has waited years for basic medical supplies finally receiving consistent funding. A school that once struggled with overcrowded classrooms now able to expand. Farmers like Issa no longer watching their harvests spoil because transport never arrived, but instead seeing roads built, connections opened, markets within reach. These are not abstract outcomes. They are real possibilities, ones that have been delayed for decades. Because when resources stay closer to home, priorities begin to change. Investment becomes local, planning becomes practical, and development becomes visible. For the first time in a long time, there is a sense, quiet but growing, that the system might finally serve the people instead of the other way around. But here is the truth that history teaches us again and again. Every gain comes with a cost. Because breaking away from a system that has shaped generations is not like opening a new chapter. It is like rewriting the entire book while people are still reading it. Inside Burkina Faso, this shift demands something incredibly difficult. Capacity. New financial systems must be built. Institutions must become stronger, faster, more transparent. Leaders must make decisions without the safety net of external structures they once relied on. And that is not easy. Because for years, many of these systems were not designed for independence. They were designed for integration into something larger. Now, they must stand on their own. And that creates pressure, political pressure. Because not everyone agrees on how fast change should happen, or how far it should go. Some will push forward, others will hesitate. And in a country already facing security challenges, even small disagreements can grow into larger tensions. Economic pressure. Because transitions are rarely smooth. Currencies adjust, markets react, confidence rises, then falls. then rises again. For everyday people, this can mean uncertainty, prices shifting, opportunities appearing, but not yet stable. And that is where patience becomes critical. But perhaps the most complex pressure of all is external. Because when a nation begins to take control of its resources and financial systems, it doesn't just change itself, it changes its position in the world. Partnerships may shift, agreements may be questioned, expectations may no longer align. And while no one may say it directly, there is always a silent calculation happening. Is this new direction beneficial or disruptive? And depending on the answer, support can turn into distance. Cooperation can turn into caution. Now bring this back to Issa. He doesn't think in terms of global finance or geopolitical balance. He thinks about his land, his family, his future. But whether he realizes it or not, his future is now tied to something much larger. A national decision that is still unfolding. A system that is still stabilizing. A path that has never been walked in quite this way before. And that is what makes this moment so fragile and so powerful at the same time. Because everything depends on one thing: execution. If this transition is managed well, it could redefine what economic sovereignty looks like in Africa. If it falters, it could reinforce the very doubts that have held change back for decades. So now, the stakes are clear, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation watching from the sidelines, waiting, learning, deciding whether to follow or to step back. And that brings us to a question that may define the future of the entire region. Can Burkina Faso turn this bold decision into real, lasting stability? Or will the weight of transition, internal and external, begin to push back harder than anyone expects? Stay with me, because in the next part, we step beyond Africa and into how the United States and the wider world are quietly reacting to this shift. Now, let's step outside Burkina Faso for a moment and look at this through a different lens, the lens of Washington. Because while this story may feel distant to many Americans, history tells us something important. What happens in regions like the Sahel rarely stays in the Sahel. For decades, this part of Africa has been closely tied to global security concerns, terrorism, migration, and resource stability. And behind all of that, financial systems have quietly played a stabilizing role. Predictable, controlled, understood. But now, that predictability is being challenged. And for policymakers in the United States, especially those who remember how quickly global dynamics can shift, this raises serious questions. Because when a country like Burkina Faso begins to redefine how it manages its money, it is not just changing its economy, it is changing its alignment, not necessarily toward one power or another, but toward something more difficult to measure: independence. And independence can be powerful, but it can also be unpredictable. For American audiences who lived through the Cold War, this moment may feel familiar. A leadership, and here because it is about security corridors. It is about influence. It is about what happens when fragile regions either stabilize or fracture further. If this transition succeeds, it could create a stronger, more self-reliant region. One less dependent, more internally stable. But if it struggles, if financial pressure builds, if political tensions rise, then instability could spread. And that matters far beyond Africa. It matters to Europe. It matters to global markets. And yes, it matters to the United States. Because in today's world, instability travels faster than ever. Through migration, through security threats, through economic disruption. So while this story may begin with a decree in Burkina Faso, its consequences could reach much further than most people expect. Which brings us to a question that many may not be asking out loud, but are certainly thinking. Is this the beginning of a stronger, more independent Africa? or the start of a shift that could reshape global balance in ways we are not fully prepared for. Stay with me, because in the final moments of this story, we confront what this really means, not just for Africa, but for the future of power itself. Tiếp. Dưới đây là task 6. Kết bài 400 từ. Cảm xúc cao, cộng, cảnh báo, cộng, CTA, so. Đúng audience Mỹ, 60 cộng. So now, we come to the moment where everything connects. A quiet decision in the Sahel, a signature on a document, has opened a door that many believed would never move. For over 70 years, systems were built, agreements were signed, and a certain order shaped how wealth, power, and opportunity flowed. And now, that order is being questioned, not with loud declarations, but with action. For some, Ibrahim Traoré represents something rare in today's world, a leader willing to take a risk, not for headlines, but for control. Control over resources, control over direction, control over the future of his people. But for others, this moment carries uncertainty, because history also teaches us this. Every time a nation steps away from a long-standing system, it steps into the unknown. And the unknown can either build strength or expose weakness. Back in Burkina Faso, Issa does not follow global debates. He doesn't read financial reports. He doesn't track international reactions. He wakes up before sunrise, just like he always has. But now, something feels different. There is a quiet possibility that the work of his hands may finally return value to his own land, that his children may grow up in a system that belongs to them. And maybe that is where the true meaning of this moment lives, not in policies, not in headlines, but in the simple idea that a nation can decide for itself. So we are left with a question that goes beyond Burkina Faso, beyond Africa, and even beyond politics. What happens when people decide they no longer accept the limits placed on them? Does the world adapt, or does it resist? Because if this path succeeds, it may inspire others. And if it spreads, then what we are witnessing today will not be an isolated moment. It will be the beginning of something much larger. So as you reflect on this story tonight, don't just see it as distant news. See it as a signal that the balance of power, economic, political, even psychological, may be shifting in ways we are only beginning to understand. And perhaps the most important question of all is this: are we watching a nation reclaim its future? Or the early stages of a transformation that will reshape the world far beyond the borders of the Sahel? If this story made you think, take a moment, not just to listen, but to understand. Because history does not wait. It moves quietly until suddenly it doesn't. And when it changes everything. Stay aware, stay strong, and above all, stay united.